This hearing will come to order, and good morning. Welcome to today's hearing entitled The Impacts of U.S. Export Control Policies on Science, Technology, Activity, and Competitiveness. And I would like to begin by welcoming our panel of distinguished witnesses, and I look forward to your testimony. And let me just say, put everyone on notice that General Scowcroft, who is an important part of this panel, is immortal, and he got stuck down in the long lines. And we try to, as a respect to those folks who are here on time, get started on time. And as he comes in, he will join us welcomely and discreetly. And so you will just let everyone know that. The nation's export control system and the related international traffic and arms regulation, as known as ITAR, were put into place to help protect America's sensitive technologies from falling into the hands of those who might do harm to this nation. In short, the export controls were supposed to strengthen our national security. However, in recent years, there has been a growing chorus of concern about some of the unintended consequences of the current system of export controls for both the nation's competitiveness in the global economy and for the nation's science and technology enterprise. Equally troubling, there are also increasing expressions of concern from experts in the national security industry and academic communities to the effect that the current system of export controls is actually weakening our national security, not strengthening it, while undermining the health of our science and technology enterprise. In that regard, let me quote from the recent National Academies report authored by a distinguished panel under the co-chairmanship of General Scowcroft, one of the witnesses at today's hearing. And I quote, "The national security controls that regulate access to and export of science and technology are broken. As currently structured, many of these controls undermine our national and homeland security and stifle American engagement in the global economy and in science and technology. Fixing these controls does not mean putting an end to them, but implementing reforms based on the realities of the risk and opportunities of today's threats to our nation," unquote. The panel then goes on to make an equally sobering statement, and once again I quote, "The export controls and visa regulations that were crafted to meet conditions the United States faced over 5 decades ago now quietly undermine our national security and our national economic well-being." Again, end of quote. Those are very serious statements from a group of very knowledgeable individuals, and I think that they warrant our close consideration. In addition, there have been a growing number of reports that have focused on the impact of current export controls regime on America's civil and commercial space programs and space research activities. Those reports have also reached some of the same troubling conclusions. For example, the Center for Strategic and International Studies Working Group on the Health of the U.S. Space Industry Base and the Impact of Export Controls, which was co-authored by another one of our witnesses today, Thomas Young, quoted, and I'll quote, "The current export control policy is constricting U.S. engagement and partnerships with the rest of the global space community and is feeding a growing separation between the U.S. space community and an emerging non-U.S. space community." And they go further to say, "Export controls are adversely affecting U.S. companies' ability to compete for foreign space business, particularly the second and third tier, and it is the second and third tier of the industry that is the source of much innovation and is normally the most engaged in the global marketplace in the aerospace defense sector." Findings such as those led this committee last year to include a provision in the House-passed NASA Authorization Act of 2008 directing the Director of Office Science and Technology Policy to carry out a comprehensive study of the impact of the current export control policies on our civil and commercial aerospace enterprise. While that provision did not make it into the final public law, I am encouraged that President Obama called for a similar review during his presidential campaign, and I'm optimistic that such a study will be initiated, and I will be in written contact with the administration making that request. In closing, I think that it is time for Congress to take another look at the nation's export control regime to ensure that it's working effectively and without unintended adverse impacts. As part of that look, we want to understand any negative effects that the current export control regime may be having on our efforts to stimulate the economy and to promote long-term growth through the investment of science and technology. This committee is starting the process with today's hearing, and I hope that anticipate that our committee will be following up in the coming, and other committees will be following up in the coming weeks and months with further oversight of other aspects of the export control issue. With that, again, I welcome our witnesses, and I will now turn to my friend Mr. Hall for any opening remarks that he cares to make.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'll skip over the paragraph where I brag on you for a couple of 3 minutes, and I also won't need to thank the distinguished panel. You've done a good job of that. I just want to say that export controls are crucial and necessary to prevent the proliferation of militarily useful technologies from falling into the wrong hands, and it's critically important that we continue to the best of our abilities to deny the transfer of these technologies to our adversaries. In today's global marketplace, as our witnesses will soon point out, it's equally important that export control regulations recognize technology that are no longer ours alone to control, and to permit the rapid sharing of emerging R&D technologies with our friends and allies. Based on a number of scholarly studies, including the National Academies Beyond Fortress America report, it's clear to me that the current export control regime fails, I think, to meet these standards. Industry and academia endure enormous cost in an effort to comply with ITAR. The price of direct compliance is fairly easy to calculate, but the more difficult cost is the self-imposed conservatism put into the place by industry and academia, because they don't understand what is and what is not a violation of clear and evolving standards. Technology is constantly shifting the landscape. What is cutting edge today may be outmoded in 6 months or a year from now. So too are the threats posed by our adversaries, and for that matter, the adversaries themselves. As a consequence of these uncertainties and the lack of transparency within the exporting licensing bureaus, industry and academia are shying away from bringing products and ideas into the international arena or collaborating with their friends and allies. This result is less business and less engagement with leading researchers the entire world over. It is, in essence, a system that's designed to slowly erode our technological superiority, which we don't want. The current system has no transparency, and as a result, export licensing is bogging down the very same R&D enterprise that made our economy the largest in the world. And as I stated just a moment ago, we have to continue to deny our adversaries access to emerging technologies, but I'm convinced the current export control regime is working against our own national self-interest. So I'm anxious to hear from these gentlemen who have put long hours and taken their time to come before us. I yield back my time. Yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from California the remaining time I have, which is
Thank you very much.
4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Hall. Clearly, America needs to nurture its aerospace, and we're going to welcome General Scowcroft here. America needs to nurture its aerospace and space technology-related industries. This is vital to the security of our country to have these industries on the cutting edge of technology, but also to be competitive with their competition overseas. And everyone understands that there is a big problem, and has been a big problem for a long time, with the ITAR regulations, and everyone agrees that reform is needed. But we, when discussing this issue, need to make sure that our high-tech exports, again, number one, are not strangling, the regulations are not strangling the industry, but at the same time, these high-tech exports are not going to potential enemies of the United States, or not going to countries which proliferate weapons of mass destruction in a way that would be detrimental to our security and the security of other Western democracies. We know exactly who the nations are that are proliferators. We also have a good understanding about which nations pose a potential threat to the United States, who are our potential enemies versus who are not our potential enemies. So whatever changes that we enact into ITAR and other export regulations should basically differentiate between the scofflaw and rogue nations, or potential enemies, on one hand, and those countries that pose no threat to us, and in fact, the largest numbers of countries that are just wishing to be trading partners. But let us note, there is a difference between the People's Republic of China, which is the world's worst human rights abuser, and also a potential enemy of the United States, versus countries like Brazil or Belgium or any other number of other countries that we can name. North Korea is not equivalent to the Netherlands. Well, neither is the People's Republic of China equivalent to India. 10 years ago, the Cox Report clearly demonstrated that U.S. technology transfers to the People's Republic of China helped improve and enhance the efficiency of China's arsenal of missiles that are aimed at the United States. As a consequence, we passed the Strom-Thurmond Act, which established requirements that before any satellite technology could be exported to China, the President of the United States had to first certify to Congress that the tech transfer was not against our national security interests or our domestic launch or satellite industries. Since the Strom-Thurmond Act became law 10 years ago, not a single such certification by a President of the United States has been made, and as a consequence, no Western satellite payloads have been flown in Chinese rockets. Let us note that when we see the progress that it's very clearly now evident in the Chinese rockets and missiles that could probably be traced back to the transfer of technology from the United States. Ironically, perhaps even worse, just tragically, that money that was taken from the American taxpayer's pocket for research in missile technology has now ended up in the hands of not only our competitors, but a potential enemy that aims missiles at the United States of America. So just as our Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was just visiting the People's Republic of China, let us note that European satellite operator Eutelsat was cutting a deal with Beijing to launch a satellite on a Long March rocket. Again, a Long March rocket system that benefited greatly in its development from the technology transfer from the United States 2 decades ago. So, incidentally, the Yotel Satellite Corporation, these satellites also make millions of dollars worth of profit from selling satellite services to the United States government through defense contracts. These things are vitally important, and Mr. Chairman, as we discuss this issue, I hope that we keep in mind the history of this issue as well as the potential problems that lie ahead, and not simply look about the aerospace industry and technology today, but where America will be in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, including Mr. Robacher, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I would like to introduce our witnesses. First up, we have Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, who is the co-chair of the National Academies Committee on Science, Security, and Prosperity, and former National Security Advisor to Presidents Gerald Ford and George H.W. Bush. And General Scowcroft, I had a sick daughter and got caught in traffic this morning, so I was late for my first meeting. They couldn't start without me, but we could start without you, and so we didn't think you would mind. Mr. Thomas Young is the co-chair of the Center for Strategic and International Studies Working Group on the Health of the U.S. Space Industry's Base and the Impact of Export Controls. Dr. Claude Canizares is the Vice President for Research and Associate Provost and the Bruno Rossi Professor of Physics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. And finally, we have Major General Robert Dickman, who is the Executive Director for the American Institute of Aeronautics and Aerospace. As our witnesses should know, you each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. And when you have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin our questions. Each member then will have 5 minutes for their questions. As former Chairman Sherry Bowler used to frequently say, although we have 5 minutes, this is a very important issue, and we do not want you to feel that you have to cut off mid-sentence. So we do want to hear from you. So we will start then with Lieutenant General Scowcroft.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hall, members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to appear before you as the co-chair of the National Research Council's Committee on Science, Security, and Prosperity. The study we have done on export controls and technology in a globalized world concludes that the national security controls on science and technology are broken. They harm our national security and reduce our economic competitiveness. These controls, which were established during the Cold War, worked well as long as three conditions prevailed. The U.S. science and technology establishment had only one significant competitor, the Soviet Union, and that was a weak competitor. 2, military research and development production took place separately from the commercial sector and generally led it by a great degree. And 3rd, a common sense of purpose existed among the United States and its allies regarding the nature of the threat. These 3 conditions no longer obtain. First, the United States has competition in most areas of advanced research and development, including military-related science and technology. The number of access points to advanced science and technology has grown considerably, and perhaps more to the point, outside the control of the United States. Second, most military production in the United States is now commercially based, thus blurring the distinction between commercial grade and weapons grade for thousands of so-called dual-use goods and technologies. And third, the alliance has lost its Cold War consensus. As a result, we're now hurting ourselves, both in terms of science and technology and economic competitiveness. The Fortress America approach of current controls cuts us off from information and technologies that we need for our national security. There is clearly a better way to manage the application of American science and technology abroad that protects our national security and our competitiveness. We need to change the mindset, and we need an agile system of security controls that can adapt quickly to the changing political and technological landscapes. Our mindset is now negative. Don't let anything out which might be of use abroad, or don't let any H-1 visa applicants in who might be a problem. We need to turn to an open mindset. Export unless there is a reason not to. Let H-1 visa applicants in unless there's a reason not to. And to improve our agility, the committee recommends the establishment of 2 administrative entities, perhaps within the National Security Council. The first would be a coordinating center for export controls that would be a one-stop shop for people seeking export licenses. This would determine whether the Commerce Department or the State Department should handle the application. Now, the applicant has to decide, and if he guesses wrong, there is months of delay in determining that. The second entity is an appeals panel that would hear and decide disputes about whether export licenses are required and whether particular decisions to grant or deny those licenses were properly properly made, and also hear appeals on sunset requirements and how they're being carried out. Our committee proposes that sunset requirements be applied to all items on the export control list and reviewed annually. Another recommendation dealing with the mindset proposes the administration of existing export control statutes should assure the science and technological competitiveness of the United States as a prerequisite to both national security and economic prosperity. To assure the conditions for scientific and technological competitiveness, the committee has recommended that the fundamental research exemption, also known as NSDD 189, should be maintained and properly implemented. The committee also proposes the establishment of an economic competitiveness exemption that eliminates export controls on dual-use technologies where they or their functional equivalents are available without restriction in open markets outside the United States. A final recommendation addresses the need to maintain and enhance access to the reservoir of human talent from foreign sources through H-1 visas to strengthen the U.S. science and technology base. The committee recommends that the President issue an executive order to put these provisions into effect. This order would not and cannot contravene current law. Rather, it would govern the exercise of presidential authorities established under existing law. The executive order would not affect anything that is protected by national security classification system, nor would it address export controls that the State Department imposes strictly on foreign policy grounds. As a first step in overhauling the overall system of controls, putting these provisions into effect would create a record and experience base that the Congress can evaluate and modify as it sees fit at such time as new export control legislation can be successfully addressed. Perhaps the most significant challenge to implementing these recommendations is to help the relevant agencies understand that these reforms will not micromanage their own licensing procedures or challenge industry or agency expertise. In closing, I'm grateful for the interest the Committee on Science and Technology has taken in this report and hope that your members will be involved, continue to be involved in this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Mr. Young, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hall, committee members. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to provide the views of the committee I co-chaired on the impact of export controls on our space endeavors. One of the things we highlighted is that we strongly support the United States' need for export controls that really do two things. One, protect technologies that are critical to our national security, and two, maximize the opportunity to maintain our leadership in critical areas. It's our overarching view that our current export controls have an adverse impact on our national security. They have a negative impact on our industrial base, particularly at the second and third tier of the base. And they complicate the relationships necessary to mutually beneficial international cooperative endeavors. These deficiencies are both serious and correctable. We found that we are controlling technologies that are not critical to our national security and are readily available in the global marketplace. The most obvious are commercial communication satellite systems, which are a globally available commodity today. The result of this overcontrol is our space industry loses international sales. Second and third level suppliers, which depend upon the international market, have questionable viability. Other countries have determined that it is in their best interest to develop indigenous capabilities rather than be dependent upon the United States as a supplier. For cooperative endeavors, the United States ceases to be the partner of choice. our access to international innovation is greatly diminished. This is extraordinarily important because the United States has always been a technology vacuum cleaner. We are incredibly good at taking technology, no matter where it comes from, and turning it to our military and our economic benefit. And we are cutting ourselves off from having access to some of the world's best human capital. In summary, this over-control by our current export control policies and procedures have accelerated the development of an international space community, resulting in the United States' preeminence being challenged in many areas. It has resulted in us becoming somewhat insular, which always results in a technological decline. Our national security and our space community have been adversely impacted. Without change, our export control policies and regulations for space will continue to erode as both a national security and an economic advantage. The recommendations in the report that General Scowcroft talked about, Fortress America, are consistent with the recommendations in our report, and they would greatly help to mitigate the adverse impact of export controls on the space sector. Our current export controls need major correction by both the administration and the Congress to reconcile the strategic intent. Items that are globally available, such as commercial communication satellite systems, should be removed from the controls. The process of implementation of the controls should be user-friendly for both the public and the private sectors. The process and procedures must be structured in a manner that allows access to international technology and human capital with minimum restrictions. We must change the policies and procedures that affect the way we treat our partners in international cooperative programs. Such programs allow us to be a full participant in the international space community, resulting in knowing what's going on, having access to technology, and builds relationships with some of the world's best minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hall, and distinguished members. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. Allow me to begin by quoting one sentence, and I quote, "The strength of American science requires a research environment conducive to creativity, an environment in which the free exchange of ideas is a vital component." This sentence comes from President Ronald Reagan's National Security Decision Directive, NSDD 189, which establishes as national policy, and I quote, "that to the maximum extent possible, the products of fundamental research remain unrestricted." Promulgated in 1985 and still in force today, the directive provides the basis for the so-called fundamental research exclusion that is embodied in current export control regulations. Our report, described by General Scowcroft, Beyond Fortress America, finds that freedom of scientific inquiry and free exchange of technical information are even much more important now than they were in 1985. He alluded to this, and I will cite 4 reasons. First, whatever dominance we might have enjoyed in our scientific leadership in 1985, we are now clearly one among many international players in nearly every technical field. Second, even within our borders, a significant fraction of our scientific and engineering workforce is international. By the year 2000, nearly a quarter of the science and engineering workers in the U.S. were foreign nationals. I would imagine it was considerably higher today. 2/3 of the postdoctoral researchers in the United States are international. Third, thanks to the Internet, the pace of scientific communications is now instantaneous, and the geography is global. The Internet does not have national boundaries. And fourth, in the present national security and economic climate, a vigorous and innovative research community is much more important than ever. Universities are the prime performers of basic research in the U.S., and they're also the source of our future scientific and technical workforce, both of which are essential for both national security and for economic prosperity of our country. As one measure of economic impact from my own institution, MIT, a Kaufman Foundation report released just last week estimates that approximately 26,000 currently active companies were founded by MIT alumni, employing over 3 million workers with annual world revenues of over $2 trillion. For universities, the primary area of concern regarding export controls involves restrictions on the sharing of technical information about controlled items with non-U.S. persons within the United States, often referred to as deemed exports. The scope of regulated technologies is broad and includes many that are available outside the U.S., as my colleagues have already mentioned. Despite the presidential directive protecting fundamental research, export controls continue to inhibit, retard, or eliminate university research projects, and there are hundreds of stories of sand in the gears because of export controls. While several positive actions have been taken in recent years by the Department of Commerce and the Department of Defense, our report suggests that a more systematic and fundamental change is required to move from a philosophy of containment and retrenchment to one of prudent engagement. Specifically, the report recommends, as General Scowcroft has mentioned, this fundamental research exemption be maintained, but also that it be properly implemented, which has not always been the case. We also recommend an economic competitiveness exemption and the adjustment of visa policies to access the reservoir of human talent in science and technology. Because you asked, Mr. Chairman, for specific recommendation for this committee, allow me personally to respectfully suggest that this committee, through its oversight of key science agencies, could play a very important role by endorsing the change in philosophy that was recommended in our report, as well as the detailed recommendations, and by mandating that each federal agency under your oversight must implement a plan and periodically report in how it is addressing these issues. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir. And General Dickman.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hall, members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to be with you today to represent our members as we address this extremely important issue. Each year, many of AIAA's 30,000 professional and 6,000 student members visit the Congress to express our views on issues important to the aerospace profession. Last year, for the first time, the subject of export controls had become such an important concern to our individual members that it was on our key issue list, along with such topics as the overall level of R&D funding and creating an integrated aerospace workforce development strategy. It is again on the list that we will address when we are back for our 2009 visits 3 weeks from today. My words about whom I represent are carefully chosen. General Scowcroft, Mr. Young, and Dr. Canizares have drawn an enormous amount of information from government, industry, and academic sources. There's little I can add to what they say, but what I do have to add reflects the views expressed by aerospace professionals. AIAA is the largest technical society in the world serving the global aerospace workforce. The vast majority of our members are scientists and engineers who are involved day to day in designing, developing, and building the miraculous systems that fly in air or in space, serving commercial travelers, scientific research, and national security. Export controls are a major concern to this workforce. Almost continually since the dawn of manned spaceflight, and certainly shortly after the beginning of the space age, the United States has enjoyed global technological leadership in air and space systems. Even today, in many areas of space capabilities, our competencies are unmatched. However, as you've heard, that leadership is being challenged in many areas and has been lost in some. There isn't a single class of space systems, launch vehicles, imaging and signals intelligence collection, position, navigation and timing, mobile and fixed communications, environmental sensing, tactical warning, and even space tourism, where there isn't a qualified foreign competitor. All of these systems have national security implications, and all are available for purchase on the global market. Not only are there competitors, one of the attributes often touted by foreign suppliers is that they have no U.S. components. They don't phrase it quite that way, though. What they say is they're ITAR-free. Our arms control regulations, as applied to space systems, not only have failed to meet the goal of slowing proliferation of technologies with national security application, they fostered the international development of comparable technologies and severely impacted the ability of U.S. firms to sell commercial products on the world market. Each year, AIAA administers about 25 technical conferences across the whole spectrum of aerospace. In 2008, over 5,300 technical papers were published in our conference proceedings. Every one of these conferences has a requirement that all papers comply with ITAR. How much collaboration, how much information wasn't exchanged because of that limitation? On the one hand, you could say that the authors were appropriately protecting information important to our national security, and in many cases, I'm sure that was correct. On the other hand, we also weren't getting insight into what is being done overseas. When our companies can't sell to overseas manufacturers, when we lose understanding of what else is in those foreign systems, when a company or an individual is reluctant to even discuss the design of a simple commercial component in a spacecraft and enter into a technical dialogue with an international colleague because of the very real criminal penalties associated with ITAR, we lose a source of information that simply isn't available any other way. As you've heard, our export policies also ripple directly into the workforce, into our ability to hire foreign nationals to work on U.S. space systems. Let there be no doubt that these individuals are still receiving the best aerospace education in the world at universities around the United States, including that of my distinguished colleague. However, unlike several decades ago, when many of the best and brightest stayed in the United States because the work was more interesting and the compensation was better, now most have no choice but to return home. We'll train them, but we can't put them to work on our most challenging problems. Not while they're graduate students, and not while they can enter the workforce later either. In a very real sense, we, the American taxpayer, are subsidizing the development of the technical workforce that is building the systems that are taking business away from U.S. companies and threatening our security. I'm not an advocate for protectionist policies. However, we obviously should restrict access to technologies, software, and hardware that are critical to national security. On the other hand, I think we're doing far more harm than good with the blanket approach to export control of space systems that's in place today. We at AIAA know this is a busy time for the Congress, and we appreciate you holding this hearing. We look forward to your questions and offer our help in any way we can serve.
Thank you, General Dickman. Unfortunately, we're going to be having a series of votes coming up soon, and this is a very, very important hearing. But I'm going to try to expedite things for everybody's convenience. So I to a great extent, had my say, although I have some questions. But I'm going to skip myself now and move to Ms. Giffords and recognize her for our first questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you bringing such a distinguished panel of speakers today on this incredibly important topic. I know that export control is not the subject that most Americans are having around their dining room table every night. However, they probably should be, because as the testimony from the gentleman today really indicated, this is an incredibly important aspect of our economy, of our national security, and of the way that we became as prosperous as a nation because of this focus on space and exploration and certainly science and technology. My first question is for Dr. Canizares. In terms of the National Academy report that identified several challenges that export controls present for universities in carrying out the fundamental research and education for the next generation, if President Obama implements the recommendations of the National Academy's report, can you talk about how much relief will actually be provided to the universities?
Thank you for the question. I think that the recommendations in the report would be a very important step. However, the real issue with the implementation of the fundamental research exclusion is how it gets implemented over and over and over again in numerous contracts, awards, technical interchanges. And one of the difficulties has been that with the philosophy, as General Scowcroft indicated, of primarily sort of trying to contain everything, we have managed to do what was described in a report that Norm Augustine put out recently from the Department of Commerce, who quoted McGeorge Bundy saying, "If you protect your diamonds and your toothbrushes with equal zeal, you will lose fewer toothbrushes but more diamonds. And I think that is and in that sense, unfortunately, that is largely what has happened. And so in the case of ITAR, we have many space projects where technical information simply on where to put the screw holes to attach your scientific instrument to a satellite is ITAR controlled and not available to a graduate student who would normally be drilling the holes. And therefore, I think the real key will be to have a change in mindset that encourages all the contracting officers, all the agencies to really implement with proper attention the intent of keeping as much open as can be kept open. That will be a difficult, long process, but with the attention of this committee and we hope of many others in the government, it's achievable, but it will take some time.
Following that, for members of the panel, I know that we will not be able to take a go-it-alone approach when it comes to space initiatives that we plan to pursue, including the human exploration of the moon, beyond, obviously, the Mars sample return, global climate change. I'm curious about the balance of our desire to cooperate with emerging spacefaring nations like China, perhaps India, on specific projects against concerns about that dual-use nature of some of those nations' activities. And certainly we have seen other countries, I mean, specifically Iran, for example, launch a satellite, and we know that the quest of, those who control the skies control the battlefield. So if members of the panel could talk about that balance.
I'll try, and then others may want to comment. I think in my opening remarks, there are things that need to be controlled. And so I don't want to leave the impression that we're advocating abolishing controls. But the advantages of international cooperation are enormous, not only technologically, but but above and beyond as a policy or part of our foreign policy. I think if we go back and take a look at even at the height of the Cold War, as General Scowcroft was talking about, our cooperative arrangements with the Soviet Union on things like Apollo, Soyuz, and other programs were extraordinarily mutual beneficial. And I think that, it gave us a stronger appreciation of some of the things that were going on with their programs and vice versa without compromising our national security. So I think relative to adversaries, I personally am an advocate that we cooperate there, but we do it in a very thoughtful manner, which is what you're suggesting. But equally important is our current controls have an adverse impact on cooperating with our friends. And I'll give you, a few examples. One is that if we sat down today and developed a relationship with the most friendly of countries for a space program, and after we had reached all the conclusions, then we give this country a raft of documents, I guess called technical assistant agreements. And if you scan through them, they sure don't communicate that this partner is a true partner, and they sign away an awful lot. So, partners say, why in the world, after I've reached all these agreements, do I need to go through that aspect of it? Let me give you one more example. Today on the Atlas V, we use a Russian engine called the RD-180. The people who were doing that program selected it because they concluded it was one of the world's best engines. You might say it fit my earlier comment of being a technology vacuum cleaner in that regard. But if we have a launch problem, we cannot sit down. This is a Russian-developed, Russian-produced today, and we cannot sit down with them and have a discussion as to what the problem is without having a new license to establish it. It goes even further. If I might just add one other, Tommy Holloway, who many of you may know, who managed both the shuttle program and the International Space Station program, chaired a study recently and said that this inability to do problem resolution in a real-time fashion added enormously to the risk associated with flying on the International Space Station. I could kind of go on and on.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Young. We're going to try to beat the bells here.
Yeah.
Mr. Hall, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask some of you about the military components. The Fortress America report recommends that export controls, quote, treat weapons separately but define them narrowly and precisely, unquote. I guess my question is how this process distinguish between a weapon system and a component that might be integral to the system. I remember somehow about the CAT scan, and when it came aboard, medical production and medical people, and maybe some folks that think different to others of us don't recognize borders. They want to share a breakthrough like that with the nations of the world. It's medical because it's medical and it helps everybody in the world. But I believe I remember, and either you generals might remember, you other men, when CAT scan came on, we didn't share that with anyone because about 15% of the technology there was involved in the M1 bomb or M2 bomb or whatever it was. It was powerful at that time. It's shared with the world now, but that's the kind of thing I'm asking about, how this might distinguish between a weapon system and any component that might be integral to the system like that part of the CAT scan was. General, you want to give that?
Well, Mr. Hall, let me take a crack.
I remember it, and I remember Rayburn Harwell too. A lot of people think.
What our study is dealing with is not items that are under the military classification system, a weapon system, or essential component parts. If it's a screw that holds things together, that's something else. But only those dual-use items where they have a commercial use and they have a valid military use. And our tendency now is not to let anything out.
That describes the CAT scan.
It does describe the CAT scan.
But we found a way, or someone's found a way, to share that with the world, and I don't object to that because I think the secrecy of the type bomb mechanism is outside our borders too.
Look, we're not going to solve all of these problems, and there are problems to distinguish. What we're saying is let's try to make those distinctions clear and more apparent, and not simply say we put the blanket over everything and we don't let anything go unless you can demonstrate.
General, thank
that
you.
It should go.
Thank you, sir. I've used 3 minutes. Could I yield my 2 minutes to Mr. Rohrbacher? He's
certainly
hurting.
Thank you very much, and thank you both the chairman and the ranking member for this very important hearing and the courtesy they paid to me to let me have a chance to ask a couple of questions and give an opening statement. First and foremost, let me just note that I represent a district that is very rich in aerospace technology, and I take the employment of my constituents very seriously. And I realize the issues that you brought up today are talking about we are putting at risk our aerospace industry and the jobs of all of my people by having an irrational ITAR regulation system. We understand that. What direction are we going to go? How do we get out of it is a whole other issue. And quite frankly, I believe that we have these restrictions because there was a transfer of technology 20 years ago during the 1990s to a potential enemy of the United States, China. And all of your suggestions about how we need to work with people overseas is absolutely correct for the health of our industry. But I take it that none of you believe that the United States should be working and having this possibility of transferring technology in order to get a contract or to build your industries at the expense of building up the capabilities of Iran or North Korea or some enemy like that, which is clearly an enemy of the United States. But with China, no one wants to face that. Let me just ask down the line, would you be willing to try, in order to open up trade with our high-tech industries and the type of business that we need to do to keep our aerospace industry and other high-tech industries competitive, would you be willing to have a dual-track system which places heavier restrictions on trade with non-democratic countries like China, and including China, versus having just the idea that we have to open up and loosen up the controls for everybody?
Mr. Hall's time is up, so if you would, I think that deserves an anser, but let's, if you could move forward maybe with a
yes or
answer.
no. Could I just have a yes or no from the panel? Would you be willing to have tougher controls on China and other potential enemies versus ITAR that would have to be open to just overall change?
I don't want to answer yes or no because I think it's a more complicated question.
I don't think it is, General. I'm sorry. What would be your answer? These are not. This is not a complicated issue. Should we have tighter controls on a country that poses a potential danger to our country than we do with democratic countries?
Yes, I believe we should, and certainly all the export regulations have that, and in fact, the recommendations of our report also allow for it.
So we should still have controls.
I will not decide which countries. It's not at all appropriate for me to decide which countries should be on the list. However,
so the answer is yes. We should have a dual system.
Yes,
Mr. Young.
Yes, I think we should have a dual system. But like General Scowcroft, it's more involved in the answer than
Nobody
that.
wants to say China. The bottom line is our major industries are making billions of dollars off a trade with China that could potentially cause damage to our national security. When our businessmen acknowledge that, we're going to have some progress on this.
If I could,
Until then, we're going to have controls because the American people can't count on our big businessmen to watch out for the security interests of our country over temporary and short-term profit.
I yield back my time.
About.
But Mr. Rohrbacher, if the Chinese can get the same product from the British or the French that they could get from us, then we don't solve your problem, but we injure the American economic competitiveness. That's why it's a complicated answer.
I will tell you,
Mr. Rohrbacher, if you would yield, it's really unfortunate.
Adolf Hitler because the French have been aiding him.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. There's a lot of nuances to this, and it's unfortunate that we're under this gun because this does need to be discussed more. But we want to try to keep some regular order. Ms. Dahlkemper, did you have a question that you wanted to? Okay, Mr. Smith, did you have a? Okay. Well, Mr. Rohrbacher, would you like to rant just a little bit longer?
Listen, again, my people are aerospace employees, and I am very concerned about the issues they brought up.
Well, why don't you? Okay, why don't we, Mr. Young?
Yeah, I'd like to respond because I think the comments are quite good. I really want to highlight the fact that the primary reason, in my view, for making the changes we're talking about is not American industry, it's national security. And our concern when we really got into this, and it's no matter what country we're dealing with, the way we are currently implementing our export controls is having a detrimental effect on our national security. In other words, I think if we make a mistake, I would be in favor of making a mistake on the conservative side relative to not harming national security. But what alarmed us when we really got into this is that the way we're currently going about it, including even with adversaries, is we're doing it in a manner that has a negative impact on our national security. If I could just add one item, not an adversary, but we had various foreign governments come in and talk to us. The Indian government came in and talked to us. They said the best thing ever happened to them was ITAR. that it accelerated their program beyond what would have ever been possible if it had not been for U.S. export controls. The only reason I point that out is that that really is a broad way that it's being implemented.
But don't you see a difference
thank you,
between
Mr.
India
Young.
and China?
And Mr. Roebuck, if I could just
I thought I was going to rant some more. What is that?
Well, you had your opportunity. We only have 4 minutes and 45 seconds to go. As I said earlier, this really is just not fair to this. I mean, this is such an important question. There are lots of nuances. As we stated earlier, though, this is sort of the opening, and I'm glad that hopefully we can, this committee hearing has put it on the table. There needs to be other hearings. This needs to be something that talked about. I am going to contact the president and ask him to once again, as we said in our earlier to our authorization last year, is that they need to take a quick look at this, or not a quick look, but I mean they need to quickly start to take a serious look at this. But as today, I'm afraid that we are going to have to come to conclusion. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for answers to any of the follow-up questions the committee might ask. And Mr. Roebucker, the committee would welcome, or the witnesses would welcome you go down and have a conversation as we continue with go on to vote. And again, I thank all of you. The witnesses are excused.
Anybody on the panel was strongly against making changes. I don't think it's like all of them are pretty much in agreement that it's important technology.